I never saw it coming. We were a happy couple, or at least I thought we were. My wife, Emily, and I had been together for 3 years, married for 2. Things had always been good, even great at times. We lived in a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood in Kansas City, and life was simple. But lately we've been talking about starting a family. I'd seen it on her face, heard it in her voice. She wanted a baby, badly. And I wanted to make her happy. The trouble started when we tried. Month after month, we kept trying to conceive, but nothing worked. Emily would get her hopes up every single time, but then the test would come back negative. It was frustrating. She never said anything, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. I was frustrated too, but more for her than anything. She was desperate, and I could feel it. We'd even started getting advice from doctors. At first, they told us it was just a matter of time, that we needed to be patient. But after a few months, when nothing changed, they suggested more tests. At first, everything seemed normal. But the tests, the consultations, they weren't helping. Emily's mood started to shift, and I didn't know how to fix it. We'd have quiet dinners at home, staring at each other over our plates. Neither of us saying anything about how much we wanted this to work. The silence was deafening. I was starting to wonder if something was wrong with me. After all, I was the one who couldn't give her the one thing she wanted most. It made me feel like a failure. She never blamed me directly, but I could see it in the little things, the way she looked at the other couples with kids, or the way she'd sigh when she looked at baby clothes in stores. I could tell it was eating her up inside, and as much as I wanted to comfort her, I didn't know how. We tried everything, the ovulation kits, the supplements, the relaxing weekend getaways, but nothing worked. Emily's frustration grew, and so did mine. There was this underlying tension that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the baby making attempts anymore. It was the way she seemed to drift away emotionally, like there was a wall between us. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, but deep down, I couldn't help but feel like something else was at play. Then came a neighbor, Mike. He had been living next door for a couple of years, a guy in his late 20s who was friendly enough. He and Emily had always been on good terms, but lately, it seemed like they were spending more time together. At first, I brushed it off as nothing, just casual chats over the fence, the occasional helping hand with yard work. But soon enough, I started noticing them talking more than usual. Emily would stop by his house on her way to the grocery store, or they'd chat outside for long stretches of time in the evening. It didn't help that Mike was a decent-looking guy, tall, athletic, always smiling. He had this charm that I couldn't ignore, but I didn't think much of it at first. I didn't want to overthink it. Emily was my wife, and I trusted her. She always seemed so genuine and loving. But the longer this went on, the more I began to feel uneasy. There were moments when I would come home from work, and Emily would be on the couch, her phone in hand, texting or scrolling, and Mike's name would pop up constantly. I'd never been the jealous type, but something about the way she would smile and quickly put her phone down when I walked in the room started to feel off. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, we'd been through a lot together, and she'd always been there for me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us. Emily didn't want to talk about the baby stuff anymore, but she seemed oddly distracted, like she had a secret she wasn't sharing. The nights when we used to curl up on the couch together now felt hollow, and instead of the familiar closeness we once had, there was this growing distance. It was as if she was shutting me out, and I didn't know why. I began to suspect that the frustration of trying for a baby was taking a toll on her in ways I hadn't fully understood. Maybe that was why she was spending more time with Mike, someone who seemed to have it all together. He didn't have the weight of infertility hanging over his head, and I wondered if she was finding comfort in his company. Still, I told myself it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. I could feel it. The tension between us had shifted from a quiet longing for a child to something far more unsettling. Life slowly settled into a routine after Emily and I started trying for a baby, but it wasn't the kind of routine I'd imagined. On the surface, everything seemed fine, even though the stress of trying to conceive was starting to take its toll on both of us. Emily seemed a little more distant, a little less engaged in our everyday conversations. I noticed it when we'd sit down to dinner. She would often zone out, looking at her phone or lost in thought, while I did my best to fill the silence with idle chatter. I didn't want to admit it, but something didn't feel right. I tried to brush it off at first. We had been through a lot over the past year, and the frustration of trying to get pregnant without success was starting to wear on both of us. But it was more than that. There was a tension I couldn't shake. The kind of tension that made it hard to talk, hard to feel close to her anymore. The little moments of affection we used to share had become increasingly rare. It was like we were living in the same house, but in two different worlds. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, that this was just the natural stress of trying to have a baby. But the more time passed, the more doubts started creeping in. After several months of unsuccessful attempts, I decided to take action. I wasn't sure if Emily was starting to feel the same distance between us, but I was. I couldn't help but wonder if I was the problem. Maybe there was something wrong with me that was keeping us from having a child. Maybe it wasn't her. It was me. I had to know for sure, so I scheduled an appointment to get tested. I didn't tell Emily about it. I didn't want her to think I was hiding something from her or that I didn't trust her. I just needed to know what was going on. I didn't want to burden her with the anxiety of waiting for the results, so I kept it to myself. Besides, I figured it would be better to deal with this on my own and then share the news with her once I had the facts. If there was an issue, we'd face it together. The appointment came and went. I sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room, trying to calm my racing thoughts. When the doctor came in with the results, I wasn't ready for what I heard. "Mr. Jensen, the test results have come back. Unfortunately, you are infertile." It felt like a slap in the face. The words echoed in my head as the doctor continued talking, but I couldn't focus on anything he was saying. Infertile. That word had never really meant anything to me until now. Suddenly, it was all I could think about. The weight of it sank deep into my chest, and a numbness washed over me. How was I supposed to tell Emily? How would I break the news to her that I couldn't give her the one thing she'd always wanted? The one thing we'd been working toward for so long. I left the office feeling like a different person. The life I had imagined with Emily, our family, our future, felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I kept replaying the conversation over and over in my mind, but no matter how many times I ran through it, I couldn't find a way to say it. I couldn't tell Emily. Not yet. I needed time to process this myself. And besides, there was something else nagging at me. Over the past few weeks, I had noticed something I couldn't ignore. Emily and Mike, our neighbor, seemed to be spending more and more time together. They'd go out for drinks, have long conversations on the porch, and spend afternoons chatting over coffee. There was nothing overtly suspicious about it, but there was an underlying feeling I couldn't shake. Every time they were together, I felt like an outsider in my own life. But even then, I didn't want to believe the worst. I didn't want to think that something was going on between them. The idea seemed absurd, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing. Still, when I looked at Emily's phone, there was nothing out of the ordinary. No strange messages, no missed calls that stood out. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overthinking everything. After all, she hadn't given me any reason to distrust her. As the weeks went by, the tension continued to build. Emily wasn't as present as she used to be. The emotional distance between us only grew, and I found myself wondering if it was because of me. Was I the reason things weren't working? Was it my fault that we couldn't conceive? But there was another thought creeping in, one I wasn't ready to face. What if Emily was pulling away from me for another reason entirely? What if there was something else going on that I wasn't seeing? The doubt and the uncertainty were overwhelming, but I wasn't ready to confront her about it. Not yet. For now, I kept quiet about my infertility. I kept my thoughts and feelings to myself, trying to hold on to the hope that things would get better. But deep down, I knew things were changing. Something wasn't right, and I was starting to fear that I might never know the full truth. A few weeks after my doctor's appointment, I was still struggling to process everything. The weight of the infertility diagnosis hung over me, and I couldn't escape it. I wanted to tell Emily the truth. I wanted to open up about my infertility, but I didn't know how. I couldn't even admit it to myself fully, let alone have that conversation with her. So, I kept it to myself, and the emotional distance between us grew with every passing day. But despite my attempts to pretend everything was fine, I could feel the cracks forming. Emily, too, seemed to be feeling the strain. She spent more time with Mike, our neighbor, and I started to wonder if she was turning to him for something I couldn't provide. The jealousy that started creeping up on me made me question everything. But I tried to push those thoughts aside. Maybe I was just being insecure. Maybe the frustration of not getting pregnant was getting to me. Then one evening, Emily came to me with a look on her face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Her eyes were wide, her smile bright, and I could tell she was eager to share something. I could tell this was big. She sat down next to me, practically glowing. "I have some news," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. For a moment, I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my mind racing. News? What could it possibly be? What was going on? "I'm pregnant," she said, almost like she was waiting for me to respond. Pregnant? How? My brain couldn't wrap around the idea. I couldn't even process it. Immediately, I was thrown into a storm of thoughts. I had been told I couldn't have kids. My infertility diagnosis had been confirmed by multiple doctors. How could this be happening? I sat there in silence, trying to hold it together, but my mind was spinning. There was no way this could be my child. It just wasn't possible. But despite the overwhelming shock and confusion, I forced myself to smile. I couldn't let her see what I was really thinking. Not yet. I didn't know how to deal with this yet. And I wasn't about to blow everything up with an accusation. "That's amazing," I said, my voice shaky. I hated myself for pretending, but I had to. I needed to know more, and this wasn't the time to confront her. "How did you find out?" She laughed softly, the excitement still dancing in her eyes. "I've been feeling off for a while now. I took a test this morning, and there it was. I'm really pregnant, Nathan. It's happening." I nodded, forcing myself to keep calm. But inside, my heart sank. I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach. There was no way she could be pregnant with my child because I knew the truth. I was infertile, and yet, here she was telling me she was expecting. I had to know more, but I didn't want to come across as suspicious. "Not yet. Are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. "I mean, you've been feeling off, right?" She smiled, her hands resting gently on her stomach, and nodded. "Yeah, I've been a little off, but I'm sure, Nathan. This is real." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't my child. I could feel it deep down. Everything inside me screamed that something was off, but I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I had to play along. I had to be the supportive husband she thought I was. I couldn't let her know that I already knew the truth. The truth that she had been seeing Mike, that the child she was carrying wasn't mine. I smiled weakly, trying my best to hide the pain I felt. "That's amazing, Em. I'm so happy for us." She leaned in and kissed me, clearly delighted. And I kissed her back, all the while pretending, all the while feeling a deep pit of betrayal open inside me. Days passed, and Emily's excitement about the pregnancy only grew. She started talking about names, baby rooms, and all the plans she had for the future. I smiled and played along, but each day, I was dying inside. The more she talked, the more I realized how well she had planned all of this. She had the future she wanted, just not with me. She had made sure I was kept in the dark, all while she carried on a secret life with Mike, our neighbor. It was clear now that Emily had been plotting everything for a while. She wanted a baby, she wanted a family, and I was nothing more than a pawn in her game. The baby she was carrying wasn't mine, and it never would be. I couldn't let this go on. I needed answers, and I was going to find them, no matter what it took. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, I went through her laptop. I hadn't found anything suspicious on her phone, but I knew her laptop would be the place where she kept everything. And I wasn't wrong. I scrolled through the files, trying to stay calm, until I came across a folder with private conversations. And there, right in front of me, were messages between Emily and Mike. They had been planning the pregnancy together. They had been seeing each other for months, and they had planned this entire situation. She had been trying to get pregnant by him all along, while I was kept in the dark. And now, she was planning on divorcing me, taking everything she could, including alimony. I felt my stomach churn as I read through the messages. I had been blind. Emily had been lying to me all this time. She had already made her decision, and I was just the guy she was using to fulfill her plan. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. The next day, when Emily came downstairs, I acted like everything was fine. I smiled, congratulated her, and told her how happy I was about the baby. But inside, I was already making plans. I had the truth now, and I wasn't going to let her think she could get away with it. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled, and I was going to make sure she couldn't lie her way out of this. A few days after the pregnancy announcement, Emily and I threw a party to celebrate. Our families and friends gathered in the living room, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. Emily looked radiant, her smile never wavering as she talked about the baby, eagerly explaining the milestones and her excitement for the future. I watched her from across the room, pretending to be just as thrilled, but inside I was numb. It was all an act. The guests lingered late into the evening, and I kept my distance, talking in short bursts when necessary, but largely staying quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had discovered. The message from Mike, the conversation they'd had about their plans for the baby, the whole web of lies Emily had been weaving. I was living in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Finally, the party wound down, and after the last of our relatives left, I found myself alone with Emily. She was on cloud nine, still talking about the baby, already planning the nursery and naming the child. I forced myself to smile and agree with everything she said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. That night, after Emily went to bed, I found myself restless. I tried to lie down, but the unease in my chest wouldn't allow me to sleep. My mind kept replaying the images of the messages on her laptop, the ones I had seen before. I had to go through it again. There was something I missed the first time, something that could confirm everything I had been suspecting. So, I got up and quietly made my way to the office. The laptop was still there, exactly where she had left it the other day. She hadn't locked it, just left it open like it was no big deal. I sat down in front of it and hesitated for a moment, feeling a pang of guilt for snooping again. But I knew I had to. The screen blinked to life, and I navigated to the same folder I had found before, the one marked personal. This time, I took my time, scrolling through each message more carefully. I didn't want to miss anything. I had already uncovered so much. Why should I stop now? As I opened the conversation threads between Emily and Mike, the weight of everything hit me like a ton of bricks. Their discussions were far more explicit this time. They talked about the pregnancy in detail, their secret rendezvous, the timeline of when she had been trying to get pregnant. She had been keeping track of her cycles, of when it was the best time to get pregnant with Mike's child, and all the while, I had been kept in the dark, believing that we were just struggling with fertility. One message caught my eye in particular. Mike had written, "Once you're out of this marriage, you'll be free. You'll get the alimony and child support, and then we can start our real life together." The words hit me like a slap in the face. The whole thing, everything had been planned. The pregnancy, the lies, the manipulation. Emily had never intended for this child to be mine. She had used me as a stepping stone, and now she was about to leave with everything she could. I closed the laptop quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The reality of it all set in. There was no going back now. I had everything I needed. I had the evidence of her affair, of her betrayal, of her plotting to divorce me once the baby was born. And she was already thinking ahead about how she would use me for money, alimony, and everything else she could get. But even though I was seething with anger, I knew this wasn't the right time to confront her. I needed to wait. If I confronted her now, she'd just lie her way out of it. She'd manipulate me into thinking I was crazy or paranoid. No, I needed to wait until she was at her most vulnerable, when the truth couldn't be denied. When the baby was born, I would reveal everything. I returned to the living room and sat there in the dark, thinking about what I had just found. It felt like a betrayal on a level I could never have imagined. She had been so convincing, so loving, and I had trusted her. And yet, all along, she was planning to leave me. I couldn't believe it, but I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I had to stay calm, keep my composure, and wait for the right moment. The next few days were a blur. Emily's excitement about the pregnancy grew, and she started making more and more plans for the future. She was so happy, so confident, but I knew what was coming. I couldn't allow myself to be blinded by her smiles and sweet words anymore. I didn't let on that I knew. I didn't say a word to her about what I had discovered. I just kept playing along, pretending like everything was normal. The act was wearing thin, but I had to keep going. I had to play it out until the right moment came. And that moment would come soon enough. The day of the birth arrived, and I could barely contain the mix of emotions swirling inside me. I had been waiting for this moment, for the right time to confront Emily. And now, as we rushed to the hospital, with Emily clutching my hand in excitement, I knew this was it. The moment I'd been preparing for. We arrived at the hospital, and Emily was immediately whisked away to get settled. I had been pretending to be supportive, pretending to be the husband she thought I still was, but inside, I was counting the minutes. The doctors and nurses came in and out, making sure everything was ready. And as I stood there, watching Emily on the bed, the weight of what I knew threatened to overwhelm me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she was prepped for delivery. The baby was coming, and everything was about to change. Just before the delivery began, I leaned down to Emily's ear and whispered, "I'm going to call Mike. Let him know he can be here when it's time." Her face went pale. She looked up at me, confused. "Mike? What are you talking about?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I thought you want him here. After all, he's the father." Emily froze. Her eyes widened, and she suddenly looked as if she had been struck by lightning. What? Nathan, stop. This isn't funny." I leaned back, watching her closely. Her body stiffened, and I could see the panic slowly spreading across her face. She was trying to hold it together, but I could see it breaking down in real time. "I'm not joking," I said calmly. "I know about everything, Emily. The affair, the baby, your plan to leave me. I know it all." Her breathing quickened as she tried to speak, but her words came out in a jumble of desperate excuses. "No, not done. You don't understand. I never wanted it like this. You're the one who didn't." I cut her off. "No, Emily. You're the one who didn't want it like this. You didn't want me. You've been lying to me from the start. You knew I couldn't have kids, and you still decided to go behind my back and sleep with Mike. I know everything." Her face twisted in frustration. Then she snapped, "You don't know anything. You don't know how hard this has been for me. You're just—" I shook my head. "I'm not here to argue with you, Emily. It's too late for that. But I want you to know one thing. I won't be sticking around to play your game anymore. I've got proof of everything, and I'm going to make sure it counts." I reached into my bag and pulled out a piece of paper. The fertility test results. My infertility certificate. "You see this, Emily?" I said, holding it up. "This proves that the baby isn't mine. So when you get your little happy family, don't think you're getting anything from me. No alimony, no child support. Nothing." Her face was a picture of horror as the reality of the situation sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked as though she was about to crumble, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. "Nathan, please," she whispered, her voice shaky. She wiped her eyes, as if the tears would somehow convince me to change my mind. "I'm sorry. It was a mistake. You don't understand." I couldn't hold back my anger any longer. "A mistake? You think this was a mistake? You plotted everything out? Emily. The baby, the affair, the divorce. You planned it all, and you were going to walk away with everything." At that moment, the door opened, and the doctor came in, ready to begin the delivery. Emily, still in shock, looked at me one last time, her face filled with disbelief and desperation. "You're going to regret this," she whispered, her voice full of venom. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her behind. The moment had come, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me any longer. A few hours later, Emily gave birth to a healthy baby boy. But I wasn't there for the moment. I wasn't there to congratulate her. I wasn't there to hold the child. Instead, I spent the next few hours at home, preparing for what came next. The divorce papers were filed immediately. There was no more pretending, no more waiting. I had everything. Proof of the affair, proof of my infertility, proof that Emily had been planning this all along. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The next few weeks were chaotic. Emily tried everything she could to get me to change my mind, sending me frantic messages and pleading with me. But I didn't respond. I had no intention of letting her back into my life. And then the phone calls from family started. My relatives, confused by what had happened, began to ask me what was going on. They couldn't understand why I was divorcing Emily, why I seemed so cold toward her, despite everything she'd said about the baby and how excited we had been. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't spare them the details. I told them everything. About the affair, about her betrayal, about the lies. They were shocked, but at least now they understood why I was done with her. And so, Emily, the woman who had lied to me for months, who had used me for her own gain, was left with nothing. She had wanted the world, but all she ended up with was a child, and the reality that I wasn't going to support her in any way. Her hysterical, tear-filled calls still haunt me. But I stand firm. The truth came out, and Emily had to face the consequences of her actions. And as for me, well, I'm moving on, one step at a time,